not a forensic.
I know.
But
I would have looked a little more less beaten up. Expectations for a functioning, systematic investigation that yields tangible results is off the table completely. Whether that's in my own case or whether that's in the Lokman Slim assassination that happened nearly 2 years ago, or any other political crime of that nature over the last 17 years, upwards to 18, the exception being the Special Tribunal for Lebanon. I don't believe that there is any substantial or any significant examination into any of those assassinations. This country does not function the way most countries function, in that there is a judicial authority that is independent or autonomous enough to do its job. There is a sub-state group in this country that determines most security concerns, and that includes things like political assassinations. When that group deems it problematic, those investigations don't happen. When that group deems it a concern, they paralyze investigations, whether that's the August 4 port blast, or when it's under certain pressure to maybe bend a bit in order to keep UNIFIL intact in Lebanon, it may surrender 1 or 2 people at most. I think the number is at 1, if I'm not mistaken. 1 of 7 have been arrested. Not arrested without Hezbollah's concern, arrested with Hezbollah's blessing. So that's, I think that's a security problem. It's less to do with governance or accountability. I think it's a security issue. It's not every case where Hezbollah and other groups are opposed to each other. Sometimes there are overlapping concerns, and one could be instability on the border. It seems like Hezbollah prefers quiet today than it does war with Israel, and I think that explains why in the last nearly 16 years, or even more, since 2006, there hasn't been much activity between the two sides. An attack on a UNIFIL convoy, an orchestrated attack where a UNIFIL soldier dies, is a severe escalation on the Lebanese side, and one that maybe Hezbollah would not want to spill out of control, and that could be one of many situations where UNIFIL sees it necessary to scale down, or maybe in later years increase its presence. I mean, that's like both are bad for Hezbollah, given the status quo that it inherited after the Syrians left, which is that they micromanage security affairs in the south, they macromanage security affairs in the rest of the country. And I think anything that pushes that in the wrong direction is a problem. Hence the unusual situation where they did hand over one person. That's an unusual occurrence, but it doesn't mean that they're working with the state to achieve accountability. I think that's a misreading. They can't overstep, and they don't want things to move in a direction that sees their comfort zone sort of scaled back. And I think that's how they operate. Hence, you don't see the dismantlement of the Lebanese state either. There's no complete collapse. There still is a Lebanese state. There still is a country called Lebanon that we understand enough. It has not completely deteriorated. I think should it completely fail, that would also be a problem for that group. Hence, it's not, I think, trying to replace the state or trying to dismantle it. I think it's trying to paralyze it. I don't think a paramilitary force that is more concerned with Iran's regional influence has any inclination to govern the day-to-day affairs of the Lebanese state. It has showed absolute reluctance to do that, even when it wins, whether it's through violence or through elections. It has shown a complete disinterest in inheriting the state as we understand the state. I think its primary concern is to make sure that this kind of nascent state that emerged after the Syrians left did not also go after its own security. When it did happen, it fought back. The most recent example is October 2021, when what is left of the judicial authority in this country went maybe a step in a direction that they were not happy with. It has been paralyzed since. There were clashes in Tayuni last year. If you go back in time, in 2008, not to do with that situation with the Air Force fighter, in May 2008, the Lebanese state tried to dismantle its telecoms network and tried to fire one airport official in airport security. And that led to a nearly 3-week civil war in the country. Fighting on the streets of Beirut. Hezbollah fighters throughout the country as well, in areas that were of strategic concern. That's when the state pushes in a direction that it's not happy with. Hezbollah was even pressured to sign a disassociation treaty from the Syrian war in 2012. It's called the Ba'abda Declaration. They signed on, saying that they would not be involved in the Syrian war. While they're signing that document, they're fighting in Syria. So I think their primary concern is how Iran can benefit and survive. Not Iran, not the protesters Iran, the regime that is also less theocratic and more security oriented, has military concerns in its sight, not Islamic law or anything like that. So I think that's where Hezbollah fits in. It's in that matrix. I think that we in Lebanon see something that's quite disorienting, which is a sub-state group with lots of leverage, but also fairly invisible. I think you can live in Lebanon and never run into this problem, or you have to go looking for it. It doesn't go looking for you. Let's say you're a tourist and you visit Lebanon, or let's say you're a student, or let's say you're studying Arabic in whatever, some language center here, and you spend a year in this country. You do what any tourist would do in Lebanon. You're going to see maybe a flag or two. If you go in certain places, you may see some more flags in certain areas, but you're not going to run into the security problem. You're not going to run into, I think, Hezbollah's foothold. You're going to maybe not see it and wonder why it's so omnipresent, but at the same time, you don't really run into it. Unlike the Syrian occupation, which was far more visible, far more intimidating on a lower scale, meaning people were always afraid to talk on the phone or even to say the name Assad in Lebanon. And you would see it and you would feel it, and the checkpoints were everywhere. Hezbollah doesn't do that. They're not occupying in that sense. They're paralyzing. And I think that's the nuance that's important, because it's not an Iranian occupation via Hezbollah. It's a state paralysis via a proxy group, which makes it, I think, harder to dislodge. No, that's more, I think, civil war, militia killing militia. I think that's probably more to do with civil war years, where groups had arms that they resorted to when needed. No, I think this is different. I can't think of a natural example, but I can think of parallel stories. Something like FARC in Colombia, or maybe ETA in northern Spain and Basque country, or maybe, and I don't know enough about this subject, it could be paramilitary forces in the Balkans, or maybe how the IRA operated for a time in Northern Ireland. But Hezbollah's story is not one of scaling down through conflict resolution, which all of those examples went through, or political transition, whether it's Sinn Féin in Northern Ireland, or whatever ETA is today, or FARC, how they find their way.
Yeah, because the IRA, as they scaled up their political wing, they scaled down their paramilitary, whereas Hezbollah, it's just growing both.
I mean, it's the political aspect. Hezbollah is one of Lebanese politics, which is not that important. Hezbollah's leverage has less to do with politics and more to do with security. And I think that explains why, had this group been a local militia, the way you were describing a group with arms that it hides, I think it would have been disarmed many, many years ago, along with all the other militia that were disarmed in the early 90s. They're the exception. This is a word that I think has changed in emotional feeling and also in meaning too. If you talk about this group in the 1980s, you're talking about a much smaller, much more focused Iranian-backed force that is accused of kidnappings, truck bombings against the American embassy or the French military barracks and the American Marine barracks. It's thought of in that world, not politics, more strategy and more violence. If you talk about this group in the 90s, you're talking about a group that is as under the thumb of the security regime that is primarily Syrian back then, Syrian intelligence, Syrian army, that they're not able to do everything that they would want to do because security under Syrian control is not always matching Iranians' interests in Lebanon. So Hezbollah also had to navigate that. So a far more curtailed Hezbollah than today, but one that is not disarmed, one that is kept as an armed force. In the 2000s, when the Syrians were here, but the Israelis had quit Lebanon and went beyond the blue line, Hezbollah became something which is far different. A group that lost its raison d'etre to fight, and a group that was trying to find its footing once the Israelis left. And that was not easy for them. And that's where their unpopularity begins. It's as soon as the Israelis leave that they're at their zenith in terms of emotional popularity in Lebanon and in the region. And it's also the turning point for them, that they don't disarm, that they stay. And they actually, for 6 years, until July 2006, the Lebanese army could not go to the south. Hezbollah was there, and UNIFIL was there, but the Lebanese army could not go to the south. So that's a Hezbollah that's evolving into something bigger. And then, you fast forward since July 2006, and you've pretty much reached where we are, which is the most important paramilitary force in the region. Hezbollah is not just here, and that's the last 2 decades. But there is a time where most Lebanese, and it's not something that's not, it's an honest reflection that Hezbollah was fairly popular until the Israelis left. Even when it had its critics politically, it had its critics in the south, it had its critics all over the place. But its popularity was also there, and I think it lost that rapidly. So there's a time where people were more sympathetic, maybe, but that's a long time ago. There's threats in the way many people face threats, but nothing that was hinting at that kind of attack. And that's the type of attack that every single Lebanese official that challenged that group in a way that was threatening to their security concerns faced assassination. So I mean, whether he was receiving text messages or letters or whatever, that happens in this country, but the culmination of that was not expected. But then again, Hezbollah over time has its concerns that its red lines maybe move a bit and has to readjust them. It could be talking to Iran without their blessing. It could be communicating with Iran without them on board. That could be a red line, but it may not be a red line always. It could be a red line when they deem it so. But what has happened since then is that the rhetoric against that group has skyrocketed. So it's not hard to meet a Hezbollah critic in Lebanon. I think you can throw, what is that phrase? You throw a stone, you can hit a Hezbollah critic anywhere in this country, including in areas that they operate. But criticism does not seem to be an issue for them. Unlike the Syrian era, where Syrians were chasing down critics of the regime. Hezbollah doesn't do that. They don't touch critics. They touch security opponents, but they don't touch critics. Hence, you're able to talk to them and do a whole story on Hezbollah with Hezbollah critics. That's an unusual situation too. They're not really into public relations, or maybe they don't care, or maybe they can't control it, and that they don't think of it as worthy of their larger concerns, which is how to navigate a changing region, especially when their patron is also facing problems too. And that's not an easy thing, I think, for an outdated paramilitary force. The question in itself shows, I think, where the problem is, which is your expectations of a state that functions separate of that entity it's an incorrect examination of how Lebanon is where it is. There's no state that challenges that group in this country. There's that group, and then there's a skeleton or a shell of what was once a semi-governable, inefficient, but maybe efficient enough state. But that state disappeared long ago. There's today a protest at the Judicial Authority, at the Ministry of Justice. Port Blast family victims are protesting. I don't know if you saw it today. They were trying to break in to the Ministry of Justice. It's been, what, 2.5 years? Almost 2.5 years. That kind of tragedy is the same story, which is nothing happens. But in that story, which is so big, and it's the scale from a targeted killing against a state official, or let's say a politician, all the way to the second largest blast in modern history. There's a huge scale there. And it's not a targeted killing, it's the collateral disaster. Even then, there's the facade of an investigation, but there's no investigation. The head judge has been unable to do his job in 1 year and 2 months. And he's a replacement judge too. Looking at it when they do feel like they have to maybe offer something in return, they do. And that could be literally 1 out of 7 names. They did not feel it necessary to surrender any of the 4 identified names in the special tribunal for Lebanon. If they're not dead, they're free. Maybe I think 2 of them have been killed. But 1 of them at least is still alive in this country. They don't feel the need to surrender him. But maybe UNIFIL to them, and that status quo that they've maintained is much more important right now than a verdict in The Hague. So I could see why they would not voluntarily surrender an identified suspect for the special tribunal, but offer somebody for this attack on the UNIFIL convoy. What is lacking is a functioning state that doesn't care what Hezbollah wants or doesn't want. It would arrest those individuals regardless of who gave them the orders and who didn't, and they would all be in jail. And that family in Dublin, I don't know where they are exactly, would have all the answers that they want, and justice, whatever that word means, is served. Case closed. Monica Borgman, her husband's killers, would be in jail. But then you have also collateral damage all over the place. You have Monica, you have myself, you have this couple that has been on TV recently, Paul and Tracy Najjar.
With the daughter, Alexandra, I think.
They're on TV today. You see him, he's really stressed, he's pushing, he's trying to break in. The country's littered with this. But none of these stories get resolved in a way that's meaningful.
Yeah.
Including, his name escapes me now.
Sean Rooney.
1 out of 7 surrendered for some stability is not, I think, what people would want from that kind of attack. But that's where Hezbollah's red lines are. When I mentioned conflict resolution versus conflict management, or let's say crisis management, what I meant was the goal, I think, should be getting to a place where reform is possible. reform in a way that is meaningful and conducive to a complicated population. And that's not something that's unique to this country. You have very strange things in Europe, very strange things. You have the capital city of Northern Ireland is Belfast, is that right? Or is it? Yeah. You have the weirdest term that could come out of European modern history, which is a peace wall. Which we don't have in this country. We don't have peace walls. We don't have walls in this country. That kind of arrangement where security posts, barbed wire, and Protestants and Catholics that just can't live together in harmony. That those walls are meaningless today, that you can walk around them, walk through them. Maybe a lot of them have been scaled down or brought down. That would have been impossible had a group like the IRA grown over time and had immense funding from another country and reached a point of where it can paralyze Northern Ireland. The reverse happened, and now those walls don't mean anything. Now people go there for tourism, which is the funniest thing in the world. Belfast is a tourist destination. But that's, I think, the template. The IRA found its way, and now Sinn Féin is just standard politics. I don't think people really think of it anymore as a paramilitary force. They think of it as maybe a stubborn political group. But people are not right now resorting to arms. That seems to work for Northern Ireland. I think the goal should be ending up like Northern Ireland, which is inefficient and outdated model of governance where it's just a little too sectarian and a little too stale, but it's working to a point. And I think that's the aspiration here, that just you can't get there. You have to first address security. That's not being addressed. What I hear more is rhetoric of that nature being applied to Lebanon, meaning why don't you guys just get rid of corruption and everyone would be happy? Or the weird way of focusing in on sectarianism in a way that makes no sense, meaning that just because groups of people live together, it's a dysfunctional country. That doesn't make sense. It's actually an odd accusation. That's nothing to do with the story. So I think the lack of interest in going down that road, I think, is because that just means war with Iran. And that is not on the table. That is off the table. And a war that doesn't necessarily mean resolution either. It could mean degeneration.
That's the article. Does justice or war with Iran?
Well, there you go.